Hey, I'm Chris Zepp from Make Everything, and today we're making a set of kitchen tools. Check it out. So the start of this project, this is a 4-part kind of thing here. So we've got 4 things I'm making. It's a cutting board, bottle opener, cheese knife, and a corkscrew. So I'm going to start off by making the cutting board, and this is some maple that I actually got from Home Depot. And I start off by just ripping it on the table saw, and I had cross-cut it on the miter saw. And now I'm just doing a quick glue up, and the reason I'm gluing up these little strips, it'll give it a little more stability, and it'll make the grain have a little more variation to it. So one of the things I want to show in this video is sort of how my process of making multiple things, everything kind of like intertwines so that the time is used effectively. And since the cutting board needs the most time to dry, I try and get that done first and get it done relatively quickly so I can work on the rest of the stuff. So I clamp this up, glue it, and then I leave that to dry overnight. Now I'll work on the bottle opener. That'll be the first thing. So the bottle openers I've made and sold for a couple of years, and so I have the blanks already made up. Basically, it's just a modified bar. It's a bartender's bottle opener that I just cut the bottom off, round it, and I drill the holes. So you can see there, those are the blanks. I have a lot of them kind of stashed away from when I was selling them online. Now the theme of this kit is all going to be with the maple, so I'm trying to use some pieces with some character for the handle scales for this bottle opener. Now I just trace the shape of the bottle opener and lay out the scales. I'll just rough cut the profile on the bandsaw, and I'm not too concerned with getting it perfect. I'm going to refine everything on the sander. The first thing I'm going to do once the scale's cut is drill the holes. So the color scheme for this is going to be maple with steel pins and steel hardware, so everything kind of has that consistent look. So I cut a steel pin and use it to locate. Now I'm just ripping that little maple scale in half on the bandsaw. So I've got kind of these little book matched scales, and I flatten them out on the 2x72 with an 80 grit belt. Now I'm just going to cut up the pins so that I have them so I can start to locate everything together. And this is just some 3/16 stainless round bar. And I deburr the corners and just make sure everything fits inside the scales. Now I'm just refining the shape, and I use the pins to make sure that those scales are exactly lined up with each other. And I start to work on the top of the scales. So it's very similar to making a knife. I have this little modified vise, and I like to sort of clamp odd pieces like this in it, and since it's got the wooden jaws, I don't have to worry about marking anything up, and I can just sort of sand the tops of the scales and make sure they're nice and smooth. So now that the scales are pretty much dressed, I can do a glue up, and I'm using G5 epoxy. So here's a little trick for using this kind of epoxy. I like to draw lines with the two different compounds of the epoxy. So I have the hardener and then I have the resin, and if you draw lines that are the same length, you use pretty much exactly the same amount and you get a nice 1-to-1 mix if that's what you need to do. G5 is 1-to-1, so I apply a liberal amount and I just bang the pins in. I'm not peening these over, I'm just getting them through the holes, and then I'll apply a bunch of clamps. So I had a problem with one of the pins. I had to knock it back out a few times and kind of grind it down, but in the end it worked out fine. Now I had to wind up putting a bunch of clamps on this because the scales were sort of shifting around, but clamp that up and put it to the side and start working on the next thing, which is going to be the cheese knife. And I just sort of freehand sketch a little cheese knife, kind of design on the fly thing. And this is just regular stainless steel. I want to say it's 3/16 compound stainless steel. So this isn't going to be a knife like I would traditionally make that's going to be heat treated and tempered. This is just for cheese. It's more like a decorative kind of tool. It's going to work well for cutting cheese, and it's going to have this little fork on the end. And it doesn't need to be, a fully tempered knife to do that. So I'm just using some regular stainless. I'm kind of trying to get this project done a little quickly. It's actually a Christmas gift for a friend, so I'm just here refining the profile a little bit with the 2x72. I use the small wheel attachment here to get inside that little finger groove and just sort of clean everything up. And now I'll head back over to the flat platen and I'll just grind in a small bevel. So I'm not marking anything out, I'm just totally freehanding this. And you know, I have a good amount of muscle memory for grinding bevels, so this kind of thing is not so hard. And I just sharpen up that little fork on the top as well. And this is a key component to knife making or any sort of metal work. This is a Scotch-Brite belt, and this is from one of the abrasive companies. It's not actually Scotch-Brite, but that's sort of the layman term for it. And it's really good for giving nice, consistent surface finishes. So it'll smooth out this stainless and give a nice, consistent, you know, brushed pattern. I just lay out the handle scales and drill some holes for the pins. Might arrest a rev mark there. Thanks, Jimmy. So again, I'm using the same maple that I used for the cutting board, just a piece with some nice figuring, and I cut it out on the bandsaw. A nice rough cut so that I can refine it later. And here I'll just drill some holes with the clamp so that I get a nice location. Throw a pin in there so I can remove the clamp and move it. This is ready to be split. So you'll notice I'm switching between two different bandsaws. I have one with a small blade for curves and a little bit bigger blade for resawing. And then I'll just flatten out these scales. The resawing blade is a little rough, so I kind of have to do a little work to flatten them out before I can glue. And I'm also going to dress the top of the scales because I won't be able to get to them once the scales are glued onto the knife handle. So now all this is happening while both the bottle opener and the cutting board are drying. And now again I can set the G5 up and I can do another glue up. So you'll see I'm drawing out some lines of the epoxy and the hardener, mixing it up, and I apply it to both the handle and I apply it a little bit to the scales. And I make sure it's in the pinholes and just knock those pins through and throw a couple clamps on there. Another important thing to note is, you know, whenever you're using epoxy like this, you want to make sure you do a good amount of cleanup with some acetone so that the glue that squeezes out onto the blade doesn't wind up there forever. It's really hard to get the glue off if you don't properly clean it when it's wet. Once it's set, it's a real nightmare to get off, and believe me, I've done it before. So at this point, it's the next day, and the cutting board is dry. So I send it through the planer, take it out of the clamps. And I'm not trying to go for any particular thickness. I'm just trying to get it down to be a consistent smooth on both sides. So I don't run it through at very heavy passes, just light passes to clean it up. And I like this little clip corner design. So first I cut it down to final length, and then I set my miter saw at 45 degrees, and I put a little mark on my fence so I can get the same 45-degree angle on every side. And I'm using this little festool sander just to clean up the cutting board and make it nice and smooth. And it's hooked up to a little dust extractor that I have underneath the bench. So I'll sand this up to 220 before I cover it in oil. So that's sitting there. While that's pretty much done, I'll take these two things out of the clamps and cut down the pins. So now I gave these, you know, overnight to dry, and just cutting the pins down on the bandsaw and then heading back over to the grinder. And this is an 80 grit belt, and I'm kind of doing some rough profiling here, just trying to really lay into the material and get the shape that I want, and then I'll refine it by hand later. So I'm using a little bit of the slack on top of the machine and also a lot of the flat platen to sort of flatten everything out and grind those pins to place. The belt was getting pretty dull at this point, so it was a little more difficult to get the flatness that I wanted, but it just took a little more time than it normally would. Now I got the small wheel on there, just finishing up that little finger groove on the cheese knife. And these are ready to get some hand sanding. So again, I'm using this little homemade vise. And if you want to see instructions on how I made this vise, leave me a comment, because I was thinking about making a video, going to Harbor Freight and making another one of these, because people have shown some interest in them before. So if you're interested, leave a comment, and maybe I'll make a video showing how I made this. It's a pretty useful little thing to have in the shop for sure. Here I'm just using a piece of brass rod with some sandpaper wrapped around it to get inside that finger groove. And once the knife handle is sort of profiled and nice and smooth, I move on to the bottle opener and just clean everything up as best I can. I also wanted to dress up the little fork I put on the end of this cheese knife with a file and just make sure it was nice and clean looking. Now these are essentially done. I just want to put a maker's mark in them, so I use my little Z stamp and I just stamp my Z in the bottle opener and in the blade. And for the handles, I decided to just soak these in Danish oil for a couple hours. And while these are soaking, I'll work on the corkscrew. So here I'm just taking another piece of maple and I'm making a little square block. And I'll punch the center so that I can drill a little pilot hole. And then I'm going to bring this over to my wood lathe and I'm going to turn this into a nice contoured handle. So I'm just bringing this from square down to round. And then I'll do some layout for sort of the center and the different marks because I want it to be symmetrical. That's a pretty simple design, basically just somewhere for your fingers to rest in, and then pretty much a flat spot in the center for the corkscrew to fit into it. I'm just sanding everything down. It's the beauty of working on a lathe, is it's really easy to get everything sanded to a really nice finish before you even take it off. And I cut off those little square ends on the bandsaw. In hindsight, I probably should have left those on because it was a pain for me to do the drilling that I'm going to do next. And now for the corkscrew, again, same way that I do the bottle openers, I was just buying a bunch of corkscrews from a restaurant supply online and just smashing the handles off of them and using the corkscrew part. It's kind of too much work to make them on my own, so here I'm just drilling a hole. You saw before I kind of sized out the size of the corkscrew metal piece, and I'm making sure that I drill the appropriate size hole in the handle, and I'm setting it in there with some super glue and a couple taps from the mallet to make sure it's seated. I give that a little bit to dry, and then I go back over to the drill press and I drill a hole straight through the handle and through the corkscrew metal piece, and that allows me to put an aluminum rod through it that I will peen onto the handle so that it will never come off. And I'm using aluminum instead of stainless because it's a little easier for me to round it over, because I don't have a great amount of surface area to get good hits with the ball peen hammer, so I want something a little bit softer. And I'm using the round side of the peening hammer and kind of the little horn of this mini anvil and kind of whatever I can find to sort of bang that in. So now I'll take the bottle opener and the knife out of the oil, clean those off and let it sort of dry, and then stick the corkscrew in there. And once that's done, these three tools are pretty much finished. Now the last thing to do is to oil up the cutting board. And anytime I make a cutting board or a serving board, I use this white mineral oil. It's food safe, it's odorless, it won't spoil. You can buy it on Amazon in this little gallon jug, and it lasts a really long time. So this kind of brings out the grain, and this stuff is done. Really happy with how these came out. You know, the maple continuous throughout is a nice little theme, and it's going to make a great gift. Now, if you want one of these, check the link in the description. You can order one from my website. Thanks for watching. I hope this video was informative and I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel. If you want to see some behind the scenes stuff about what goes on here at Make Everything, follow us on Instagram at Make Everything Shop. And if you're interested in one of these tool sets or some Make Everything gear, check out our web store. Link below. Thanks again, and we'll see you on the next video.